And then if you are able to get to one and you have a car, and that's the way that you got there, they don't have parking because of where they're zoned. And so this is interesting challenges. And then as a patient, you don't have any guidance. There's nowhere that you can go to find out and get recommendations on what to actually use. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of scientific literature to support how to advise patients. And luckily some of that's getting addressed, but that's still going to be years before we actually have reasonable answers and are able to give reasonable guidance. So let's start at the top with one of the things that people are always concerned about is what type of product should I actually be using? So there are topicals. These are generalists. You've got topicals, of course. There are creams that have high concentrations of THC in them. Some people use them for arthritic pain. Some people use them for musculoskeletal pain and find them to be effective for that. There, of course, is the traditional flower. Everybody who's been to college knows about that. And that's generally inhaled through smoking or even some sort of vaporization technique. There are, in fact, vaporizers, not vape pens, but vaporizers that will allow you to vaporize actual flower, so you don't have to use the concentrates. That's an additional cost, of course. Then there's vaping. This is something that we will talk a little bit in more detail about, especially with the negative press that's been going on about vaping. But this is still really sort of an inhalant. It's still really a smoking process, and of course that's stuff that's going into your lungs. And then there are edibles, which are, you can have different types of candies, different types of chocolates. Some of them are even in tablet form, in dissolvable powders that you can put into teas and things. There are actually even cannabis teas. They're wonderful. And these are different types of edibles that have a different absorption mechanism. So for a second here, we're going to talk about flower and vaping and what the pros and cons are with that. So obviously, this is in some ways easier. It's in some ways more effective, and it is in some ways much more immediate. So the pros here are that the dosing is much easier. You have immediate control over how much you actually inhale. It provides immediate relief. It really does. Within about 10 minutes, you will feel the effects in some way, shape, or form. And with respect to vaping, it's actually a very cost-effective way to get this, whereas flower is much more expensive because it's consumed much faster. It also has a shorter shelf life. Now, I don't actually know the impact of shelf life on the components within there, whether it actually matters to this, but there are a lot of people who will say the potency goes down. I'm not sure that the potency of these products in terms of like the amount of THC in it is actually something that's impactful for patients. I have not felt a difference between stuff that is super fresh and stuff that has been, in my house for 3 months. I'm not sure that potency is really the biggest, potency as used in the industry is really the biggest problem. But then, of course, the negatives are that you're smoking something or you're inhaling something into your lungs, which, of course, can also be problematic. And, as we're seeing the vaping crisis, frankly, anything that you inhale into your lungs can be considered dangerous to your health. And that should be obvious, but is not always for people. Of course, I already covered the cost of flour. And then, as we know, the vaping crisis at this time is causing a lot of reservations among patients about whether they should be using these products in that way or not. So let's talk a little bit about the alternative. The major alternative to inhalants would be edibles. And I'm, again, talking for neuropathic pain management, because topicals for me were not particularly effective for the neuropathic pain. Other stuff, yes. Neuropathic pain, no. So one of the positives about edibles is that it's not smoking. You're taking it in a form that is fairly normal. The dosing has been worked out very specific to the size there. It's discreet. it's not smelly, you're not going to look like you're a cannabis user, and so for a lot of people, that's something that you would take into account. Like for example, if you're at work and need to redose, because some people have different issues than I do and may feel that need. But here is one of the problems with dosing. People get misdosed on edibles all the time because the starting dose that is recommended at the average dispensary is 10 milligrams of THC, and the average size of the person that they're recommending that for is not a 200-pound male with no comorbidities or other drugs that they are on that could be interacting with it. So that's very challenging. It has a much later onset, so it can be 1 to 2 hours with the normal. Now there are new products that have come out that will molecularize, and you'll be able to actually feel the impact within 20 minutes, but normal available edibles, typical onset is 1 hour to 2 hours later. And most people don't recognize and understand that and think that it's having no impact because they're not feeling anything, and end up redosing, and that ends up with additional complications, as we said, with not the standard overdose, but overdosing people. And then the cost of edibles, they're extremely expensive. They're much more expensive than other products. So that's something that people have to weigh the benefits of. So I already covered the cost for medical cards. The doctor, the card. A lot of times the cost to get these will be $400, $500. And some places will drop the taxes on that if you are a medical card recipient versus adult use. But you have to have a pretty substantial amount of cannabis, purchase a substantial amount of cannabis annually to actually make that worthwhile. And you generally have to go and revisit with the doctor and reattain your medical card every year. Some places I believe are doing every 2 years. I think that's the Arizona rule now, but in most places it's on an annual basis. You have to go in and get a doctor's recommendation and get your card renewed. That's not economic. Like the economical difference between adult use and medical use, when you start factoring in the taxes, it would take using over $1,000 worth of product annually in order to actually benefit from having a medical card. This is one of the reasons that I actually am in favor of full adult legalization across the board, rather than just for medical use, because it does improve access. It will improve cost. And honestly, the cost of attaining the medical recommendation and card can be prohibitive for people. A lot of people with these types of issues are fixed income. So we really have to be mindful of cost when we're making recommendations in this space. So of course we've covered the expense of edibles. Topicals and flower are also extremely expensive when you're talking about per dose. And the issue here, of course, is that vaping is the most cost-effective mechanism for delivery on this. And it ends up being one of the easier ways to dose as well. So this is a complicated problem, especially with the things that are coming out now. Then the taxes in a lot of states increase the bill on top of the cost of the actual product by half. So 1/3 of your bill on a cannabis ticket goes to taxes. It's pretty exorbitant, and that ends up impacting the patient substantially. So you can understand where patients are getting the idea that if they go to the black market, they can get these things illegally. They think they're getting the same thing at a better cost. And obviously, as we've seen, that's just not the case. Without a regulated legal market, you're talking about very dangerous product that could have all sorts of impurities that have been added to it. That's, of course, a huge problem. So I talked briefly about geographic access. One of the other things that comes up in this is zoning restrictions. Again, this is not like a normal, this is not treated like a normal drug. So it's zoned very typically in these industrial areas that are not good places for patients to go. It's difficult to access them. You can't get to them through public transit, and this is very specifically in medical states. It's very difficult to get to the dispensaries if you don't have your own mode of transportation, and then when you get there, there's nowhere to park. And for people with ambulatory problems, this becomes prohibitive as well. So with respect to dosing, we desperately need dosing studies. We need dosing studies that discuss weight, that discuss differences in male-female metabolism, that discuss drug interactions. We have no idea what those are at this time. There's also the issues that come up when people get overdosed. They feel nausea, dizziness, real panic. And the problem with those overdoses that come through the edible system, at least, they last, you stay at the peak of that for 4 to 5 hours, which is enough to induce a lot of panic and dread in the patients who are just trying to take care of themselves. There are some that say that CBD, cannabis-derived CBD, will counteract that in large doses. Studies need to be done on that as well. It's not proven. My own experience does not go in consensus with that, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen, right? So a 10 milligram starting dose is really for a 200-pound man with no comorbidities, with nothing that they're using it for recreational purposes. That does not make sense for the majority of people. And then, of course, there's the strains, the different strains of cannabis and what they do. So indica is one that is called, in quotation marks, a body high. And what that means is it helps with pain. That's the type of cannabis that I actually use for my own pain management. It's very effective for neuropathic pain. It helps with insomnia. It's outstanding for sleeping. It's incredible. If you have kids and they wake you up in the middle of the night, you will sleep through them with this. You'll be able to get back to sleep too. It's fantastic. Hybrid is supposed to be this in the middle thing where you get the pain management, but don't necessarily get the drowsiness. That sort of depends. There's a range of hybrid strains that, you know, lean more towards indica or lean more towards sativa or right down the middle. And it's unclear a lot of times when you say hybrid what you're getting. And then sativa. Sativa is really an upper. This is the one that people use when they say that they're getting creative. It's supposed to be non-drowsy. I have not found it to be particularly helpful for pain management myself. And the other thing that it has a tendency to do is increase anxiety attacks. And for me, I have found that it triggered my PTSD disorder that resulted, of course, from my injury and all the things that I went through. So in talking about CBD, so there's two types of CBD. There's hemp-derived and there's cannabis-derived. Cannabis-derived has a very good supply chain impact to it. It is regulated the same way as all of the other cannabis products. Regulation in this industry, it is the most regulated product, and particularly agricultural product in the world. Really the work that the states have put in place in terms of making sure that the product is safe and available to consumers in a safe format is quite stringent. The hemp-derived CBD market, is not the case yet. We don't have it along the same supply chain, and there have been incidences where the CBD product has been tampered with after being manufactured and turned into a distillate product or some other form that can be turned into other products. There have been some unscrupulous middlemen who have been actually cutting the product with, what's it called, baking powder. And so it's unclear at this time if the product that is hemp-derived is actually coming from sources that are legitimate. And that's particularly for the end products, like the drinks, the powders. If they're coming directly from the manufacturer, generally speaking, you should be able to trust that. There's a lot of pride of authorship, where people will not tamper with products that they're selling. But when you get to the middleman, of course, it's not their product, so the pride of authorship goes away. And so you have to be very careful about where the CBD product is actually coming from, if it's from hemp-derived sources. And so this brings me to the regulation side. We talked a little bit about that. So one of the things that's very attractive about the cannabis market in terms of the regulations that have been put in place is there's testing of product to ensure safety in multiple locations along the way. And this is mandated in most states. So for example, it's tested when it comes off the farm. The product, like the cannabis flower itself is tested for impurities. It's tested for illicit, not illicit, but illicit for this product, pesticides. It's tested for mold or anything else that could cause illness to a human. It is tested after extraction processes have happened, which create these oils, the oils in the vapor, for example, vaporizers. And then it's actually tested again after it has been filled into the vaporizing cartridges. And so this is the product that you're talking about when we're talking about the vaping epidemic, is these vape cartridges. And so I'm just talking a little bit about where this comes in the legal market and why it's extremely unlikely that the tainted products came from there. We even had, yes, I'm going to give an example here. So in the California market, because of the 3 tiers of testing there, actually, I think this happened about a year ago, there were a lot of cartridges that they were using cartridges that had been purchased from China, from overseas, and when it actually went through the processing and filling, it came out that they were tainted with lead, and they were not allowed onto the California market. Those products were destroyed in accordance with the regulations in California for product that was tainted and unsafe for use in the legal market. So these are some of the things that are in place if you're talking about obtaining product from legal sources as opposed to illegal sources. I cannot think of a single manufacturer